This is a Frontline Club event recorded on the 26th of May 2020. Hacks Go to Hollywood. How to get the most out of your journalistic intellectual property. A discussion with Misha Glenny, Martin Bright, Melissa Fish, and Luke Speed.
Journalists potentially sitting on some very obviously important stories and some very valuable intellectual property rights. Let's go to Misha Glenny. Misha, tell us about your journey with McMafia, because it started off, it was an investigative book about crime families, crime syndicates and their links to legitimate parts of society. And it sort of transformed, eventually became the story of this rich son of a Russian crime lord who finds himself a legitimate businessman, but is pulled eventually into organized crime. And I know that was a journey from the story, the book, to the screen that took many, many years. Just take us through that and how it changed and the journey.
Well, it began actually before the book was published, about a year before the book was published, where I'm also represented by Curtis Brown, not by Luke, but it was Nick Marston who sort of distributed the book to various companies, and Working Title picked it up, and they gave it to two writers, and they wanted to turn it into a film. And so one of the things you learn about dealing with film and television, particularly if you're a non-fiction writer, is that there are many, many, many hurdles to overcome before anything gets anywhere close to a screen. And so it takes you a year or two to realize that somebody being interested in something, somebody reading it, somebody lining up writers and things like that doesn't amount to a hill of beans necessarily. And so the key thing is to manage your expectations on this, because at first, of course, there's all the glam about your work's going to go on to film and television. And it took 10 years. And it went through about 4 or 5 iterations, McMafia, with different companies, with different writers. I'd just given up on it. I mean, it was just bubbling along in the background. But then, ironically, one of the original people who Working Title had commissioned to write a script, and did write a script, Hos Amini, approached me together with his friend James Watkins, who directed McMafia, the TV show, and they said, "Look, can you give us 6 months to work with this material, because we really want to turn it into a television show." And this was at the point when everything was shifting from film into television. Both Hoss and James came from film, and everyone was wanting to get a show on Netflix or HBO or the BBC or whatever it was. But because Hoss and James had such a stellar reputation, Hoss is Oscar nominated, it went over several of those hurdles quite quickly into the BBC and AMC. And what you have to realize is that when you sign away the book as an option, and then you sell the book for a film and television, you have signed away the book. You do not have the right to sort of interfere and to say, you should be doing it this way or whatever. Now, as it happened, James and Hoss and I got on very well. I had an executive producer credit negotiated, and they invited me, which was a big privilege, into the writer's room, because they found it useful having me on hand as a sort of permanent reference when it came to the big question, which is authenticity. And just to put this, before I finish, into a sort of broad context, with the explosion of television, you have great writers, you have great directors, actors, producers. What they lack in London and in Hollywood is content, is stuff which is actually real. And this is why journalists over the past 5 to 10 years have actually started to play a role in the great television shows and in film, because while they've been honing their skills as writers, directors, and actors, we've been running around the world finding shit out. And They want to know what that stuff is. So if you get into it and you start to develop relationships with actors, with agents, with writers, producers, and so on and so forth, you can be fairly honest and develop pretty good relations. But you have to know that you're not a writer, you're not a producer, you're not a director, and you're not an actor, and that your role is quite a specific one.
Right. Misha, thanks for that. Sorry, I should have said, by the way, to everyone who's tuning into this, that if you have a question during the course of our panel discussion, please could you use the Q&A function. You can type it out and then I will be able to see it. We can either feed it into the discussion or we can come to you a little later on. And when I do come to you, please eventually unmute yourself so that you can ask your question in due course. Okay, so Misha, you obviously have the intellectual property rights in your book. Can I just go to Melissa? Let's take a bit of journalism that isn't a book. Let's take just an article, for instance. Who owns, let's say, I don't know if I'm writing it for the BBC or Martin's writing it for The Guardian, who owns the intellectual property, the rights in that work? Is it me? Is it the BBC? Do we share them? How does it work?
Okay, so if you're talking about an article that you've been commissioned to write in the way that you mentioned, rather than you're sitting down to write speculatively, then the outcome is going to be different. So whether you're a freelancer or you are an employed journalist, you will have an agreement with whoever your employer is, and there will be a clause somewhere in that relevant agreement stating that all IP, all intellectual property rights and other rights created are assigned to the employer and therefore owned by the employer. So this is definitely something to be aware of, and it's always worth checking your drafting.
Okay. And a lot of people will be employed journalists, so they've got a great story. They've got what they think has real potential for drama or podcast or whatever. What do? They go and talk to their employer, and then what happens? You have a conversation. Do they say, well, you can't do it because we own all the rights and we're gonna sell them? Or do you, some better than others, some easygoing, some not? How does it work?
No, I mean, look, rights are valuable, and there's a reason why they say that everything that you conceive or any idea that you work on whilst you're employed by them technically belongs to them. That's not to say that you can't have a conversation with your employer about working on a project going forward that may be based on something you originally worked on for them, but the reality is that they will be the owners of the rights, and therefore you can't just kind of go off and start selling them to publishers or film rights to film producers. You do need to ask for permission in some shape or form, or otherwise it would be infringement. So that's the position if you're working for someone and there is an agreement in place, a written agreement that says that everything that you do is assigned to them. It's worth knowing that rights don't move by a verbal contract. So for rights to be assigned, it has to be in writing, and it has to be for something of value. Otherwise, they would be staying with you. And that's something that people don't tend to realise about rights.
Martin, let's go to you, because you didn't sell the intellectual property rights in your story, but you did do a life story rights deal. We'll get Melissa to sort of explain precisely in legal terms what that is, but just take us through, as Misha did, your journey from doing the story in 2003 to the film coming out last year.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. I mean, it was a very long process. And I have to say that the Observer was extremely generous in terms of the intellectual property. Never raised a question about its own claim on the story, or indeed demanded any money.
Did you go and tell them? Did you ask them, can I now take the rights off, or go and talk to film companies?
Well, no, because it was never considered. The only thing that I ever negotiated was my own life rights. which they don't own. So my role in the story was what was important to the filmmakers, and so it was important for them. And Melissa can go into this in more detail. But in order to construct something that you can sell to financiers and get insured as a film, you need to make sure that everyone concerned is signed up. Everyone whose life is being portrayed in the film in a substantial sense, but also in this case, a book that had been written about the story of Catherine Gunn, the GCHQ whistleblower at the centre of the story. So from the beginning, I was involved in selling my rights, the rights to my story as the journalist at the centre of the events. This began in around 2008, when I was initially approached by two screenwriters who'd previously only really written rom-coms, it has to be said, and they had bought the rights to the book. They approached me. I don't know how unusual this is, but they, as the writers, approached me for my life rights, and indeed Catherine and her husband. And from that point on, we kind of came as a package. We decided at that point, Catherine and I, that our fates were forever intermingled, and that we needed to make sure that at every stage we made the decision together to move forward, and whoever offered us deals, that we would only proceed if we agreed to do so.
Martin, the book about the story wasn't your book. The journalism was yours, but the book wasn't.
No, and I have to say that this was, I mean, I thought it was a good story, but it was just one story among many. In fact, I'd done, I think, 4 stories that week, as you do on a Sunday newspaper, you know. And so it hadn't crossed my mind that this would make a book. I wish it had. But it didn't, and so it was, in fact, an American author who wrote the book. So at that stage, it was me just talking about my life rights, and as in Misha's case, it went through many, many, many iterations. The original screenwriters did remain as a part of the filmmaking process throughout, but the script was completely rewritten by the director, Gavin Hood, and the original life rights passed to an American producer called Elizabeth Fowler, who, in fact, when she first called me, I thought it was a friend just pretending to be a Hollywood producer, I have to say, which is, as Misha said, the best attitude to have really to these things, a degree of healthy skepticism. And then ultimately it passed to a company called Raindog, which is run by Colin Firth and a producer called Jed Doherty, who's a former music business guy. And from that point, things accelerated. And I was lucky really in that, as with a book, when you sell your life rights, you sell everything. I mean, you sell the writers the freedom to make of your story what they will. I could have been made a villain. I could have been made even more comical than I am. And in the end, I was very lucky to have an extremely sympathetic writer-director who wanted the events to be as close to reality as possible. But it didn't have to be that way.
Were you not especially lucky in the sense that you, under the first life rights deal, they portrayed you, and indeed the work that you'd done, and the kind of, you know, screaming at interns and that kind of thing in a way that you perhaps wouldn't have liked, but you were tied by the life rights deal, but then it ran out and you were able to correct some of that stuff next, you know, with the next life rights deal?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I mean, the original writers were, they were very sympathetic. I mean, they had made the decision that they wanted to write Official Secrets from the book without consulting with Catherine and myself at all. They bought our life rights, but they didn't want to talk to us. They didn't want to be hamstrung by that. And so it did take on a life of its own in a classic way, that initial script. I had I had my own massive office, for instance, which would never happen in a British newspaper for a mere correspondent like me. I had secretaries. I had an intern who some people may know now because he's called Faisal Islam, who's now a rather prominent journalist at the BBC. Yes, it was rather. So I also had a kind of romantic frisson with Catherine as well at one point, for a little bit of completely inaccurate love interest, as I hadn't even met the woman by that point. So yeah, I mean, they took a lot of liberties, and so I was very, very glad when the final script didn't have any of that stuff in it.
Can I just throw in one little thing here, Clive, about Hollywood and indeed the BBC's and everyone's portrayal of journalists that Martin points out there is they're incredibly bad about getting the atmosphere of what it's like being a journalist. And it's almost as though whenever you see, a journalist's office, everyone is running around sort of shouting, "Tokyo, hold the front page," and this sort of thing. In fact, it's much more mundane than that. And I think it's actually useful that journalists have a certain influence on films, as Martin, I know, did do in the final iteration, which came to the screen, so that we have a bit more realism about what this profession is like. But that's a side point.
Okay, well made. Yeah. Let's ask Melissa and Luke a little bit about these things. First of all, let's just nail down, what is a life story rights deal? It sounds as though you're almost sort of selling yourself into slavery or giving away your identity. Just explain what it is.
Okay.
Let's Melissa first, and then we'll talk to Luke about that.
So we talk about these life story rights, but it's a bit of a myth because we don't actually own our life story rights. No one does. There's no legal basis to assert this. So technically there's nothing to prevent anyone from making a film or a TV series based on your life or mine, but it's the associated risks that have to be considered, as well as various benefits that Martin and Misha have touched on. And the risks that we need to be aware of here are, firstly, defamation, secondly, invasion of privacy, and then the third one, which Martin mentioned, is that if there's a high risk of a claim, then a film or TV production company might struggle to obtain something called errors and omissions insurance, which basically they have to close the financing of the film or the TV production. So it's risky to move forward without the cooperation of the subject because of the associated risks, rather than there being, a so-called breach of life rights. So rather than call it, a rights acquisition style document, it's more of a cooperation agreement where the subject basically agrees not to sue, and in return they might get some money, a credit, possibly a share of back-end profits.
But look, generally speaking, I'm right in thinking, aren't I, that life story rights, you don't get an awful lot for them. I mean, you're talking about what, a few £1,000s normally, something like that.
Yeah, look, the ones that I've worked on haven't been massively lucrative, but it's been, it's either been a good place for their career. It's always nice to have a credit. It's also exciting to be part of a production. There's loads of different reasons, and there may not be, masses of money up front, but typically underlying rights holders will get a share of the profits if the production does well. It's not, major, but it's something. Luke can probably speak more about the figures though.
Sure. Luke, I wanted to ask you, I think we probably nailed down what a life story rights deal is. But what is emerging from this is that, this is a thicket of complex, rights issues, obligations, life rights deals, intellectual property rights deals. Why do journalists need an agent like you, and what do you do with them? How do you work with them?
Well, I suppose effectively, being an agent's a manager. You know, you're also confident, and you're effectively helping not just to use a better term, exploit the rights on behalf of the journalist. I help monetize those rights. The way we work with our journalists is actually getting to think about the long-term plan. You know, how are they going to become a producer? How can we get them writing drafts of scripts? That's my goal, and that's, you know, I think it's very easy just to, you know, sell an article here or there, but I think, you know, going back to life rights, it's about how we can add value to that project. You know, I've got multiple projects where, you know, we've gone after the person at the center of the story to secure their life rights in association with the article or the book, because, well, it's two things. First, in Hollywood, there's a huge premium on exclusivity, so you're immediately locking down the ability for anyone else to try and make that story if that person whose story it is associated and connected with the project. And two, once you take that project into the marketplace, it has extraordinary value, whereas before you might have got a great deal, you're getting a different kind of deal with the life rights attached, because as Misha said earlier, it's about the authenticity. It's about what that person brings, I think, and how it's identified and how the project's perceived. But going back to your question about being an agent, it's really guiding the clients in the marketplace. It's making sure they are talking to the very best producers who are going to give their project the very best chance of making it to the screen. You know, you're looking for champions, people who are going to like nourish and cherish that particular client and help them on their career. You might have one journalist who probably has, you know, possibly have 3 projects for the same producer, simply because they are really backing them. And you're looking at all sorts of different fee structures. You're not just selling, you know, the rights and taking an EP position, and you might get a bonus down the line. You know, I've got clients who are, you know, getting extensive development fees. You know, I've got one client who's got the first look deal from a studio in the UK. You know, these people are taking some 6-month sabbaticals from their, you know, incredibly busy, you know, desk jobs. There's, you know, security correspondent to the Sunday Times, for example, just allowing them to focus on their film and TV work. So really an agent's a guide, a manager, to answer your question directly.
Okay. The questions just come in. What about if your story involves someone who is no longer alive? Is it best? Do you still have to seek, you know, life rights deals, or you know, speak to the families of people who may no longer be alive? Melissa.
So I always perform this kind of risk assessment when I'm advising a client on life rights, and I usually act for the producer, so the person who is kind of acquiring them. And my first question is always, dead or alive? And it's possibly the only time it's good news to hear someone's dead, because in terms of legal standing, if you are deceased, then you don't have the standing to bring a claim in court for defamation or invasion of privacy. I should probably say, though, that's in the UK. There's different positions in different jurisdictions. I think the States does have post-mortem rights of publicity, so that's something to be aware of. But yes, it's good news if they're dead.
Because Misha, am I right in thinking that your one of your projects is based on a real person, and you know, just
everything I write is based on real people, because I'm a non-fiction writer.
Yeah.
So
but it's sort of very focused life story, if you like.
Yeah, Nemesis is the life of the guy who for several years ran the largest drug operation in a favela in Rio, and I interviewed him for 30 hours in prison, and I interviewed his family members, I interviewed his enemies, the police who investigated him, the chief of security in Rio State, and everyone involved with his story. And he has I am doing it at the moment. I'm working up a script with a Hollywood producer, but we're doing it for television. We're not doing it for film. And he and his girlfriend and their collaborators are doing it for Brazil. in a separate operation, and we agreed to divvy it up in that way. We have a very good relationship. I mean, it's very sort of business-like, but it has had a few complications in it as a consequence. But I think we're more or less we're more or less over that now. And it's just a question of, you know, of maintaining good communication with people and being upfront with them about what you're actually doing, and then being upfront with you. And if you have developed a relationship of trust, then that's okay. And we did this also around. I was very concerned to. So some of the money from, if the TV thing comes off, some of the money will be going to a charity in the favela which he used to run. And I want to make sure that people inside the favela don't feel as though they've been exploited by this whole thing. So I maintain relations with friends and collaborators there as well. But it has been tricky on occasions. It's true.
Questions just come in, which I think will a lot of people will want to know the answer to this. What about if the subject matter is pretty much in the public domain? There are some books on the subject, but you know, the subject matter has been covered through multiple sources. Do you have to option anything, do any deals at that point, Melissa, or do you just say, well, you know, this is so out there that it's fair game, anyone can write a screenplay, anyone can make a documentary, whatever?
So, you know, the answer is it kind of depends, right? Because it's always going to be on a case by case, turning on the facts. The first thing to say is that there is an exception in the copyright legislation for the reporting of current news events, which is obviously a big one to point out in an event full of journalists. But then, you know, it's a question of interpretation as to whether something's still current. And usually if it's still very much a matter of public interest, then it would be considered to be current. But it's a bit of a grey area. And then I suppose the second thing to say is that whilst news and facts and information are not subject to copyright, so you wouldn't be infringing, it's the creation of a story from those facts that is. So, you know, putting the information and the reporting together in a certain way with opinion and expression, that would attract copyrights. But if you are literally just you've looked at something and it's kind of the date, the people, the place, what happened, and it's pretty factual, then you're safe from a rights perspective. But it's a tricky one because people say to me, oh, but it was public domain. And I say, okay, but what about this piece of information? Didn't this piece of information lead you to that source that then led you to the next source that led you to your ultimate final source? And they say, well, yes. And I said, well, then you've relied on it. You know, it kind of, it sparked and it was the basis of your work. So, you know, at the very least, we should try and get something down on paper. You know, you might not necessarily need to pay anything for it, but let's get a release or a quit claim, and then you just know you're safe. So I guess that's a very long way of saying you can't just rely on the fact that something is public domain. You have to kind of question how you got there and what it led you to work out if on the way you may have inadvertently copied someone's idea or piece of journalism or writing.
Sure.
I have to say, Clive, I'll just come in here because the Nemesis story that I was talking about is very relevant to this, because there was a third party who wanted to come in and do the story, and basically, and he's trying to do it still, I don't think he'll succeed. He basically has to rely on my book because it's the only one with a comprehensive life story of this guy. And I discussed this with my agent at Curtis Brand, and essentially, this is where, as a non-fiction writer, you're in a much weaker position than a fiction writer. But basically, if someone's going to go off and do a story roughly based on his life, there's actually very little I can do about it, particularly if it's in a jurisdiction like Brazil. it's really tough. So as a non-fiction writer, your protection is significantly weaker than fiction writers.
Honestly, I agree, but I think it depends on who is making your show. If you've got one of the best producers in the country with a major writer or piece of actor putting that together, most people really will veer away from that and not try and do the same project, from my experience.
True.
Yeah. Interesting. Very quick question to Martin and to Misha that's coming. Is there anything you wish you'd known back at or is there one thing which, if you had known back at the beginning of the process, would have put you in a better position, a stronger position? Martin? Oh, I think you've muted yourself, Martin.
Yeah, sorry.
Start that again.
If someone had told me that I was in a stronger position than I imagined, that would have really helped. I think we are slowly beginning to realise that there is a desperation for compelling content, and that we as journalists have stories coming out of our ears, and whether they're historical stories or stories that we're working on now, these are meat and drink to the sorts of people that are desperate to get content particularly into TV.